What's up and welcome to another episode of It's Tip Top Fishing. My name is Keaton and today we're doing my top 5 tips while fishing near weed, or in weed, or close to weed, or around weed. And we're not talking about the fun weed. Okay, before I get going, I just want to quickly say a big thank you to all you guys that are watching. Please remember to subscribe and comment and like and do all those cool things. And an even bigger thank you to my patrons. Thank you to all of the contributions you guys have made to help Tip Top Fishing get out and make videos like this one for you guys.
And lastly, a big thank you to Academy Lakes for hosting us. It's a fantastic venue with big, beautiful fish and an even better fishing community. Now let's get to it. Weed fishing.
Now, why would you want to fish near weed, around weed, in weed? Big reason in terms of carp fishing is carp like structure because they feel protected, and then also weed holds a lot of food. They've got a lot of little snails, little invertebrates, all kinds of things live in weed and around weed, and the carp can feed in it, they can also feel protected in it, and they can also rest in it. So they spend a lot of time in and around weed. Also tends to make a patrol route. So say there's a lot of weed here, the carp will swim along it because they want to get to the other side of the dam instead of swimming through it all the time. So they just tend to hug the outside barrier of the wall of weed. So tip number 1, know where the weed is. Now that sounds very simple, but it's not as simple as it sounds, because you can find the weed on the top, which is very easy to find. All you got to do is look over the water and you can see where all of the weed that touches the top of the water is. You can see weed that grows from the bottom to the top. You can see where the leaves touch the top. You can see the lily pads, and you know that there's weed underneath the lily pads. Where it gets a bit more complicated, there's a lot of types of weed grow underneath the water and they don't get to the surface. So if you just look over the dam, you can't actually see that there's weed underneath it. So how do you find that weed? Well, a Deeper Chirp Plus 2 is what I use. It's a fish finder. Now fish finders help you see underwater basically. It gives you a little graph of what's going underneath the water, and when you know how to read that, you can pretty much see that there's weed underneath the water. Now when using a fish finder, a deeper or another fish finder, what I would suggest is you use a medium or a narrow cone. So that means the area of searching that you're doing when you're fishing near weed is very small. Why? Because the smaller the cone, the more detail you're going to pick up. So now with the Deeper Chirp Plus, you can literally see individual plants while you're going past them. It really helps you find where the weed is, and you can find the gaps in the weed. Usually the gaps in the weed are created by carp feeding because they've uprooted some weeds. So those are great spots to find. It's very important to know where your weed is, because once you find the overall, the macro scale of all the weed, then you'll know the patrol routes of where the carp are going. And then the smaller areas, in terms of more detail on where the weed is, you can find pockets and fish in those pockets. Tip number 2, your leader. So the leader needs to match the type of weed that you're fishing in. Now why? Well, basically, if you're fishing in soft weed, it is better to use a braided leader. Why? Because braided leader tends to cut through the weed nice and easily, especially like a 50 pound or something like that. But if you're fishing in harder stuff like harder reeds, or if you're fishing near like trees and things like that, you don't want to go for braid, because braid will dig into it and get stuck, and then the carp can break off. Rather use a monofilament. Monofilament handles the harder stuff better. It tends to go over it instead of digging into it. Now, while we're talking about leaders, I would double the length of my leader. Why? Because if you don't get to that rod in time and the fish pulls off a lot of line, you will have a bigger buffer area where your leader will be stronger for a longer period of time. So if you are going to fish a 2 rod length leader, double it. Do a 4 length leader, so that when the fish find your snags and they get into the snags, you've got a bigger area of thicker material that can handle it, and then the carp are less likely to get off. So double your leader length. Number 3, now you should either sky your rods, or you must backlead right underneath the rod tip. Now those are completely opposite things, and it's opposite for a good reason.
Okay, forgive my bad drawing skills. Let's go for the floating weed example. Here's some floating weed, so water hyacinth with their awful little roots that catch everything. Here's your rod, and we would backlead straight down from the rod tip to the lake bed. We want to go straight down because there's less surface area for the water hyacinth to catch your line. The water hyacinth has to literally go underneath your rod tip to catch your line. And if you've ever fished with floating drifting weed, all it does is catch your line and then slowly pulls your rig off the spot, which pretty much screws up everything. Now for argument's sake, let's take a look at if we backleaded normally, the diagonal backlead. So from the tip of your rod to the backlead, there is your diagonal backlead. Now if you look here, there's a massive surface area where the weed can pick up your line, which is what you don't want. Rather backlead right underneath your rod tips and give the water hyacinth the middle finger. Okay, let's go for the second option, the skying your pod. Why would you want to sky your pod? You'd want to sky your pod when you've got lots of underlying weed. So here is your hook bait, perfectly placed in a gap in the weed. Now if you took your line straight to your hook bait, it would go through all of that weed. And you don't want that because all the carp has to do is swim sideways for a little bit and it hooks you in all of that awful weed. Now, this is why you would sky your pod. You sky your pod because you lift the rod tip and change the angle of attack, which lifts most of your line off the bottom and away from that underlying weed. If you left your rods as normal, you would be straight to the lead and straight through all of that weed, which is not what you want. Rather sky your pod, be over all that weed, hook and land your fish. Now let's get back to Keaton on the bank.
Thank you, Keaton in the studio. I appreciate your explanation. It helped me a lot. Okay, tip number 4. You want to lock up your rods, not lock up entirely, but make sure that when a fish picks up your rig, it's not going to get very far before you get to the rod. And you want to stay close to your rods. If you are far away from your rods, that means while that fish picks up your rig and runs, it's going to have a bit more time to get into trouble, a bit more time to wrap around some reeds or to crisscross and get itself all snagged up. If you're close to your rods, that means there's less time for the fish to get into cuck. And then also if your drag is a bit tighter, it's going to have to work a lot harder to get further away and have more slack or more line to tie you up with. Okay, tip number 5. Tip number 5. Now, this is talking baiting strategy. Now, what I would suggest when you're fishing near the weeds is an X-shape fishing strategy. Now, what does that mean?
It means that your bait for your chum or your free offerings will be shaped and spread out in an X shape. Your hook bait will be in the middle, the one line of bait will be along the reeds, and the other line of bait will be from the deeper water all the way up into the reeds.
Why you do along the reeds is so that any fish that is using that patrol route past the reeds will pick up your bait and work its way to the middle where your hook bait is. Why do you want to do the other side where you're going deeper water and into the reeds? It's because if the fish are swimming further away from the reeds, they will still pick up your bait, or if they're in the deeper water, they'll pick up your bait and then work their way to your hook bait. And then why you want to put it in the reeds? Well, if the fish are sleeping or chilling or relaxing or feeding in the weeds themselves, your bait will actually draw them out of the weeds to your hook bait. And where you want to put that hook bait is about 1 to 2 or maybe even 3 meters away from the reeds. You don't want to be too close, because the closer that hook bait is to the reeds, the more likely that carp is going to run into the reeds and it's going to snag you up. Now, the bonus tip. The bonus tip is a pretty simple tip, and all it is make it easy to drop your lead. Why? Because leads get caught on stuff. And if your lead can be dropped off easily, like on a drop-off heli safe or a lead clip, that means when that lead comes into contact with some reeds or something, it gets stuck, it'll actually come off and then detach itself from the line. It no longer is your problem. The line can go a direct route from your rod to your fish, and it doesn't have to get stuck in other things. The less things that can get stuck while you're weed fishing, the better. Okay, that is it for this episode of It's Tip Top Fishing. If you want to contribute to Tip Top Fishing and help me make more of these videos for you guys, please check out my Patreon page. Every little bit counts, and everything that I make from that page is dedicated to fishing. So I'm not going to go and buy a new iPhone. Every cent that I make from Patreon gets spent on Tip Top Fishing and making videos for you guys. So thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. If you've got any other tips for fishing in the weed, pop it in the comments below. And that's it for this episode of It's Tip Top Fishing. Tight lines, guys. Live, your adventure.